Okay, so today we're diving into some pretty interesting malware. It's got the cybersecurity world kind of on alert right now. It's called StilachiRAT.
StilachiRAT.
Yeah, and it's pronounced StilachiRAT. What makes this malware stand out is how targeted and how sophisticated it seems to be.
Yeah. This one is being described as a novel and like really advanced remote access Trojan, or as most people know it, a rat.
A rat.
It's not like those general threats that kind of just try to go after anything. StilachiRAT, this one seems to be purpose-built to go after specific types of data.
And when we talk about specific data, we're really talking about digital assets.
Yeah.
You know, crypto wallets, passwords, usernames, really anything you use to log in.
You hit the nail on the head. We're seeing a big trend towards malware being designed with digital currency in mind. And it's not just for people actively involved in crypto either.
Yeah.
This is about safeguarding all of your online accounts because, well, that's everyone these days. So understanding this StilachiRAT, understanding what it does, is going to help you protect yourself.
Exactly. So in this deep dive, we're going to take a look at what StilachiRAT actually does when it gets on a system. How do you know that you have it? How do you detect it? And most importantly, how can you protect yourself against it?
Right. We're going to give you the breakdown so you can stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah, getting ahead of the curve is kind of the whole point, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Because even though right now the sources are saying that StilachiRAT isn't super widespread, it's just the fact that it's so advanced. You know, the threat landscape is changing constantly. Getting to grips with this now is a smart move.
So let's start from the very beginning. What does this malware do when it infects the computer? Our sources are pointing to this initial phase called system reconnaissance. Basically, it's like the malware takes stock of what it's working with, right?
It's like it's doing inventory of the whole machine. And it does this by gathering tons of information right at the start. It does it by using WMI queries.
WMI queries?
Yeah, think of it as the malware asking the computer a bunch of specific questions to get all this detailed information.
Okay. Yeah.
And this includes everything. Your operating system, hardware IDs, everything. They even mentioned it grabs the computer's serial number to create a unique ID for the device.
So it's not messing around.
Yeah.
It wants to know everything about its new environment.
Right.
And it goes even beyond the basic system info. It's checking if you have a camera, whether RDP is active, which is Remote Desktop Protocol.
Right.
And it even gets a list of every single graphical application you have running.
Yeah, and I think when you look at it from the attacker's perspective, getting all this information, all this profiling, it gives them a really good picture of who their victim is and what their setup is.
It's like a reconnaissance. They're getting the lay of the land.
Exactly. And that knowledge can be used in a lot of ways. Like maybe they can figure out who the high-value targets are, or if this computer is on a network, they can use that information to move to other systems within the network.
Yeah. That's a little scary.
Yeah.
So, okay, it's got all this info, but remember we talked about digital assets, right?
Right.
How does it go after cryptocurrency wallets specifically?
Well, it doesn't just randomly search your computer. It scans the Chrome registry looking for data about crypto wallets. And not just a few, we're talking 20 different crypto wallet extensions.
20. So it's not picky. It's going after all the popular wallets.
It doesn't matter what you use, they're going after it.
Wow, that's serious. Can you give us some names, though, like of the wallets that they are targeting?
Oh, yeah. Some of the big ones you've definitely heard of are MetaMask, Trust Wallet, Coinbase Wallet.
Right.
There's also Bitget Wallet, which you might remember as BitKeep and TronLink. I think it's really clear from this that their interest in crypto theft is very real.
It's a huge red flag. So they're looking for these browser-based extensions, not just general crypto software. And they're looking in this very specific registry key. Software, Google, Chrome preference, MEX default extensions, .settings.
Yeah, and I think that just goes to show how sophisticated this malware is. They know exactly where these wallet extensions store all of their important data.
They've done their research.
They have.
Okay, so we know they can get into crypto wallets, but what about those traditional online credentials? You know, usernames, passwords we store in Chrome. Does StilachiRAT try to get those?
It does. Stealing credentials is another one of its core functions, and it doesn't just find the credentials, it tries to decrypt them. It goes after two very specific files that are part of your Chrome profile.
Can you tell us what those files are?
Yeah, one of them is located at %LokiOPay Google Chrome user data local state. That's the one with Chrome's master key.
Okay.
And that's the key that encrypts your passwords. The second file is %LokiLPay Google Chrome user data default login data, and this is where the actual usernames and passwords are stored.
So it's going after the lockbox and the stuff inside the lockbox. How does it get around that encryption, though?
Well, it's a bit technical, but essentially StilachiRAT takes advantage of Windows APIs. Think of those as like legitimate functions of the Windows operating system.
Right.
And it uses these functions, it uses these tools as the login user, which lets it decrypt that master key and then get access to all of the credentials.
It's using the system's own tools against it.
Exactly.
Clever. Okay, so let's say it has all this sensitive information now. It has to send it back to the attacker, right?
Right.
So how does StilachiRAT talk to its command control server?
We usually call them C2 servers.
C2 servers.
Yeah. So StilachiRAT is programmed with two main addresses for this C2 communication.
Okay.
One is a domain name. It's app.95560.cc, and the other is a direct IP address, 194.195.89.47. And the IP address, it's stored in a kind of a weird format. It's harder to detect that way.
That's sneaky. And how does it blend in? Like, what internet traffic does it use?
It uses standard TCP ports, so like port 53, which is usually for DNS lookups, port 443, which is the standard for HTTPS web traffic, or even port 16,000, which is used less often. And they pick one of these randomly, so it's even harder to spot.
So they're trying to hide in plain sight, basically.
Yeah.
Now, our sources did point out a couple of interesting behaviors when it comes to connecting.
Yeah, so what's interesting is that it has this delay.
A delay?
Yeah, a 2-hour delay, sometimes even longer before it tries to connect to the C2 for the first time. And that's actually pretty common with sophisticated malware.
I guess to avoid detection.
Exactly, because a lot of the automated analysis systems, or sandboxes, they only look at a system for a short amount of time after it gets infected. So this delay, it helps StilachiRAT avoid getting caught by those systems.
That's so smart.
It is. And there's another thing. It actually checks to see if this tool called tcpview.exe is running.
tcpview.exe, what is that?
That's a tool that cybersecurity professionals use to analyze network traffic.
Oh, okay.
So if StilachiRAT finds that this tool is running, it won't connect to the server. Basically, it's making sure that nobody's watching it.
It's really checking its surroundings.
Wow. And then what happens when it does connect? What's the first thing it does?
The first thing it does is it sends a list of all the active windows, every window that's open on the computer at that moment.
It's telling the attackers what the user is doing at that exact moment.
Exactly. They want that snapshot of the system. They know exactly what's going on.
So the attackers get a live view of the desktop, essentially.
Pretty much, yeah.
What kinds of instructions can the attackers send back? Like, what commands can StilachiRAT actually run?
Oh, it can do a lot. There are a bunch of different commands, and they each have a code. So, for example, Command 07 lets them show a dialog box on the infected computer.
A dialog box.
Right. And they can put anything they want in it, like HTML content from another website. Imagine like a fake login prompt that looks totally real.
Oh, so they could phish people that way?
Exactly, right on their own screen.
That's so sneaky.
Then there's Command 08. This one clears event logs on the infected computer.
Event logs, so wiping out the evidence. Exactly. They target the security log and the system log specifically. It's classic anti-forensics.
It's covering its tracks.
Yeah, it's like it was never even there.
And what's this about Command 09 using an undocumented API? That sounds unusual, right?
It's not something you see every day. They can basically reboot the whole system using this undocumented API.
So they're going deep into the system. What other commands are there?
Well, Command 16 can start any application on the computer.
So they can run anything they want.
Pretty much, yeah. And they do it quietly, too, in a hidden console window. Then there's Command 30. This one specifically triggers the Chrome password stealing that we talked about.
Okay, so not only can they run anything they want, they can also specifically start that password stealing process whenever they feel like it.
Right. It's a lot of control over the infected system.
Now let's talk about persistence. We know that malware wants to stay on the system even after it's been restarted. So how does StilachiRAT make sure that happens?
Well, there are a couple of things it does. One is it can register itself as a service with the Windows Service Control Manager, the SCM.
Oh, so it just runs in the background all the time?
Exactly, like it's supposed to be there. And then there's something called watchdog threads.
Watchdog threads.
These are like little monitors that constantly check to make sure that the malware's files are still on the system.
Okay.
So if they're missing for any reason, these threads can just recreate them.
From like a backup copy or something.
Exactly. They have their own hidden copy. It's like a self-healing mechanism.
Wow, that's impressive in a scary way. What about these registry modifications we keep hearing about?
Yeah, so for that service component, if it gets removed, The malware actually changes some things in the Windows registry, and then it tells the service control manager to restart the service.
Oh, so it comes back even after a reboot.
Right. And the watchdog threads, they keep checking for those malware files too.
So it really wants to stay put. Now, another thing that came up was RDP monitoring. StilachiRAT can actually keep an eye on what's happening on remote desktop connections.
Yeah, and this is a big concern for anyone using RDP, especially servers where RDP is often used.
Right.
So StilachiRAT can monitor all the active RDP sessions, and it can see everything on the screen. And even worse, it can copy security tokens.
The security tokens.
So it can pretend to be the person who is logged in through RDP.
So it can steal their identity, and if they have admin privileges, it could be a disaster.
Exactly, especially on a server. They could move around the entire network, take control of other systems, do all sorts of damage.
That's pretty scary.
It is.
Okay, let's move on to data collection. What does StilachiRAT do besides stealing those specific credentials and wallet info? Our sources mention clipboard monitoring and file iteration, which sounds a little unsettling.
Yeah, it's constantly watching the clipboard, but it's not just passively watching, it's actively looking for sensitive information, like passwords, crypto keys.
Like it's scanning the clipboard.
Exactly. It uses regular expressions, which are basically patterns that can find specific things in text.
So like a search, but way more advanced.
Yeah, way more targeted.
Can you give us an example of what kind of patterns it's looking for?
Yeah, so for example, it has patterns to identify Tron addresses. Those are like TRX addresses.
Okay.
TRX private keys, and even TRX passphrases. So if you're copying and pasting any of that stuff, StilachiRAT is probably going to try and grab it.
You have to be so careful.
You do. And then there's the file iteration we talked about. It basically goes through all the files on your desktop and in your recent folders.
So they're looking for anything interesting, basically.
Yeah, anything that might be valuable. It casts a pretty wide net.
Okay, so let's talk about how it avoids detection. StilachiRAT uses some pretty advanced anti-forensic techniques, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like it was designed to stay hidden.
We already talked about how it clears event logs. That's a big one.
Right.
But it also tries to figure out if it's being analyzed, like if it's running in a sandbox, which is what researchers use to study malware.
So it knows when it's being watched. What else does it do?
It does something called API-level obfuscation. Instead of using the normal Windows APIs directly, it uses checksums and this thing called XRR masking.
XR masking?
Yeah, it's basically a way to scramble instructions, like using a secret code. So even if somebody gets a hold of the code, it's really hard to understand what it's doing.
This is deliberately making its code unreadable.
Exactly. And on top of that, they have custom algorithms to encode text and other values in the code. So researchers can't just read the code and know what it means. They have to figure out the code first.
It's like a puzzle.
Yeah.
So it's hidden and hard to understand. That's pretty concerning. So given all of that, how can you even tell if you have this thing on your system?
Well, the good news is that Microsoft Defender antivirus can detect it. They call it trojanspy.win64stalachiae.
So keep your antivirus updated. Okay, what about other tools like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint? Are there any specific alerts that security teams should be looking out for?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There are several alerts in Microsoft Defender for Endpoint that StilachiRAT could trigger, like if a process is injected with malicious code, which is something it does, or if they detect process hollowing, which is another one of those sneaky techniques to avoid detection.
Right.
There are also alerts for suspicious services and alerts for possible theft of passwords and other sensitive information from web browsers. So if you see any of those alerts, you need to investigate.
Those are red flags, basically.
Exactly. Red flags for sure.
And what's this about Microsoft Security Copilot prompt books?
Yeah, so if you're using Microsoft Security Copilot, they have these things called prompt books, which are basically like guides.
Okay.
And these guides help you with the investigation and the response if you think you might have StilachiRAT. They help you get all the right information, analyze user activity, even create reports about the threat.
That sounds helpful. What about actually hunting for this malware?
Yeah.
Are there any specific things that security teams can do to actively look for it in their environment?
Yeah, absolutely. Microsoft has a bunch of these things called hunting queries that are specifically designed to find StilachiRAT activity.
Oh.
Some of these queries, they look for suspicious network traffic. You know, on those ports we talked about, 53, 443, and 16,000.
Right.
And they specifically look for connections to those C2 addresses that we talked about. There are also queries that try to find signs of the malware trying to stay on the system, you know, to persist. They do that by looking at specific system events.
Oh, okay.
Like when a new service is created, when a service's start type changes, or when a new service gets registered.
So monitoring those things can help. What about the anti-forensic stuff?
Yeah.
Like the clearing event logs? Can you actively look for that?
You can. There are queries for that too. They look for specific event IDs in the security log and the system log. And if you're using Microsoft Sentinel, they have queries that can find event logs that have been cleared, and they can also see when services are being installed or changed.
Okay, so there are definitely ways to proactively look for this threat. Now, for people on the front lines, what are those key indicators of compromise, like the things that they should absolutely be watching out for?
The most important ones are the SHA-256 hash of the main malicious DLL. That's www.startupctfl64.dll, and the hash is 3947474DD67 2 EDO D ECAN 0 A0 D FEFA 80 DV E069 pre FA EC3 EWA Max 645 Ishi 8 D3 and LF 6448 Persa 1 CD 8 BE T3 at 25 ESAWA 1 per 9 P922 fans ULA 8 CF 4560.cc.
Okay, security professionals can use that information to see if any systems have been infected. Now, the big question, how do you protect yourself from StilachiRAT?
Well, like with most malware, the best defense is prevention.
Easier said than done sometimes.
Right, but the most basic thing you can do is to only download software from official websites and trusted sources.
Yeah, that's good advice in general.
And don't forget about your web browser. Use one with Smart Screen enabled, like Microsoft Edge. That can warn you about risky websites and downloads.
Those are great tips.
And for organizations using Microsoft 365, definitely turn on safe links and safe attachments.
Okay, and how about more proactive stuff like security settings on your computer and network?
Enabling network protection in Microsoft Defender for Endpoint can actually block access to known bad websites and IP addresses. And there are some general hardening guidelines that are good to follow regardless of what kind of threats you're facing.
Okay, let's hear those hardening guidelines.
First, turn on tamper protection in Microsoft Defender for Endpoint.
Tamper protection, okay.
That stops malware from turning off your security software. Next, make sure your EDR is set to block mode. That gives it the power to stop malicious stuff automatically.
Right.
Then set your investigation and remediation to full automation. That way the system can deal with threats immediately. Turn on PUA protection in block mode too.
PUA protection, what's that?
That's protection against potentially unwanted applications. Those are programs that might not be full-blown malware, but they can still be harmful or annoying.
Okay, so block those two.
Yeah, and make sure cloud-delivered protection and real-time protection are on in Microsoft Defender antivirus or whatever antivirus you use. That gives you the latest protection and constant scanning.
So basically you're saying layer your defenses, make sure all your security tools are working, and keep them updated.
Exactly.
Our sources also mentioned multi-factor authentication.
MFA.
MFA, right. How does that help with a threat like StilachiRAT?
Well, even if StilachiRAT manages to steal your password, if you have MFA turned on, they still need something else to get into your account.
Like a code from your phone.
Right. Or a fingerprint scan.
Makes it much harder for them.
It does. And of course, keep all your software, your operating system, everything updated. Patch those security holes before malware can exploit them.
That's basic security hygiene.
It is.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive into StilachiRAT, this is a new, really sneaky piece of malware that is all about stealing data. Crypto wallets, credentials, you name it.
Right, and it goes to great lengths to stay hidden.
Yeah, we talked about all the techniques it uses.
And right now, it might not be everywhere, but it has the potential to become a big problem.
So everyone needs to be aware of it and take steps to protect themselves.
Absolutely. And luckily, there are ways to detect it, especially with Microsoft's security tools. And, we talked about all the things you can do to protect yourself. Those proactive steps are crucial.
This brings up a really important question for you, our listeners. With these threats becoming more and more advanced and targeted, especially towards things like crypto, what other steps can you take? How can you go even further to protect yourself? It's something to think about.
It is.
We always encourage you to keep learning. Check out the Microsoft Threat Intelligence blog. See what's new, stay ahead of the curve. In this world, knowledge is power.
It really is.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.